Okay, hi everyone. It is the 18th of January, 2025, and I've decided to come and talk a little bit about the 1972 summit series between the Soviet Union and Canada, which was hockey's greatest and most important, probably sports' most important series that's ever occurred, not only from the sports perspective, the transformation that came from it, the political ramifications of it, the unbelievable storyline almost to the point of it seeming scripted. But in this case, and while I've said a lot of professional sport is scripted, this one I don't think could have been. It would have required too much work. This was literally something that was beyond any expectation of what could have occurred in this month of September 1972. I have quite a background in this series. I've studied it quite intensely. Sadly, I can't say there's one great book that's been written on this subject. And no, I'm not going to write a book on it. But you kind of, if you took like about 10 of the books that are out there and combined them all, you would have the story. It's never been for my eyes, really laid out well in one particular book only. A recent one came out maybe about 8 or 10 years ago. Richard Bendel, along with a friend of mine, Paul Patsku, they put out a book on the 72 Summit series, and if you're not a stats geek, you might find it a bit dry because it's loaded with statistics, but there's a lot of information in that book, particularly things that are missing in a lot of the other books. And you kind of have to combine all those together. There's a few decent documentaries. I've listed one below for those of you who want to look into that. But yeah, my background in this, I gave a lecture in 2018 to the combined Canadian and Russian embassies. They were playing a hockey tournament together back when these countries could actually have conversation and speak with one another. And I did this combined lecture, which was a little bit, it was a little intimidating to be up there and have all of these embassy staff, including all the ambassadors and whatnot of both of these countries sitting there. It turned out to be an extremely interesting discussion. I'm not going into the detail of the series here. I went into the detail of game by game to lay out, because the majority of the people there would have no idea at all what this series was. They maybe somehow knew that it happened, but a large percentage weren't even alive then. What was interesting was the Russian ambassador, happened to be about 8 or 10 years old, and his father, I guess, was like a police chief in Moscow, so he was at the games, and I think as well the ambassador himself was either there, was in as a child with his father, or was certainly, he was around the rink. He was around what was going on. So he was 10 or 15 years old. So it was really interesting to add those shared experiences to the story, which also was great for me. One of the things that, like, if you watch the documentary below that I listed, and there's about 3 or 4 documentaries that have come out. This is the oldest one. This is the first one that came out on the series around 92. Shows all the goals, shows all the key moments of all the games. Almost all of the interviews are by Canadian players. I think Tretiak is the only one who gets interviewed in this particular documentary. There are some later documentaries that have more Soviet interviews, but I found that the documentaries themselves are lacking in really presenting some of the total package that goes into the series. So again, just like the books, you'd have to watch like 2 or 3 of the different documentaries to really get the full overview of what's going on. So I'm not doing a full overview here. There's lots of stuff out there. You're welcome to go look at it. I'm going to pick on a few key elements about this series that tends not to be talked about very often. And that's what I want to go into is some of the things that are, let's call it, not recognized. We're going to end this with because usually this series is presented as not just having important political ramifications of bringing East and West together for the first time, of opening the doorway to European ideas in North America, European players coming to play in North America. It's always presented as this great change that happened to hockey, and that is true. But that's a long-term thing that people think of it like the 1970s and hockey's totally changed, and it didn't, particularly in North America. North America changed very little. It was Europe that changed drastically, and it was Europe that took huge advantages afterwards from this series. And actually, North America went, well, they didn't go backwards, they stayed still. And so they wound up going backwards by standing still, but everyone else is moving ahead of them. But I want to get into some of, like I say, some of the key elements of that's rarely talked about this series. First is the roster construction of the two teams. So obviously, if you know nothing about the series, like, go watch the documentary. Just stop this, go watch the documentary, go get a good overview, look into some of the stuff. Okay, then come back and you'll have a better idea of what I'm talking about. But given that the Soviets had risen so quickly in 10 years, Canada had always been sending an amateur team to compete at the World Championship or the Olympics, usually an Allen Cup winner. They would but by the 1950s, that Allen Cup winner didn't want to go anymore. Teams actually didn't even want to go to Europe to play anymore, partially because that they weren't being paid to go, that they were just expected to go there and almost, in a sense, lose their own money, not lose their money, but, to have to pay out of their own pocket for being in Europe for competing for Canada in these championships. And more teams said, we're not going. And so weaker and weaker teams had to start being sent. Now, that doesn't mean that by the 1950s, when the Soviets began to win the World Championship, that a better, more complete amateur team would have guaranteed to win. No, but it's indicating that it was starting to indicate that amateur teams from Canada were not able to compete with the so-called amateur teams of the Soviet Union, which, of course, this was a big problem that kicked in the 1960s, which was Canadians were very clear that this was not an amateur team, right? An amateur has a job which they go to during the day. They work in a factory, they work at a steel mill, they work in whatever, and then they play hockey at night, and they get all their money from the work, and they worked all day. That's an amateur. In places like the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia, these were all members of the army, sometimes the police force, but they did no armying or policing, which we'll also see becomes very unique in the final games in Moscow, that the army-trained Soviet players did not handle the battle conditions of the series like the Canadian hockey players did, Canadian NHL players did. But the fact that there was nothing going on was easily presented by Boris Mikhailov years later, when he said he was a colonel or captain in the army, and he had never once learned how to fire a rifle. So they were there to play hockey and train. The Soviets did something that North Americans didn't think was important, and that was physical training, physical preparation, off-ice conditioning. These were things that kind of existed in Canada, but not really. That was just not something that was thought of, nor was it thought of that there were different ways to play. And one of the people who had these ideas, right, was someone named Lloyd Percival, who wrote a book called The Hockey Handbook in the late 40s, which the Soviets took with great focus as part of a small part. It sometimes gets too big of a the word I'm looking for. Too big of a package point as if this is the reason that the Soviets advanced. No, the Soviets advanced because of taking ideas from soccer, taking ideas from other sports, taking ideas from how they had handled bandy previously and moved it over to hockey. So the Soviets had been building a different team, a different way of doing things. And part of it came as well in how the team was not just packaged, the kind of systems they were using, of things that are common now: puck control. Don't give up the puck unless you have to. Cycle the puck in the other zone. Move the puck backwards, not always forwards. These kinds of things were all part of a new Soviet way. Not that it didn't happen in North America, just it was very rare. The game was, if you watch an NHL game from the 1940s or 50s, it's a game of just rush with one player doing most of the work and the other guys kind of fitting in a bit near the end when there was an opportunity. And the Soviets were devising 5-man unit systems. But the coaching, the first thing about the roster construction of 1972, which was very surprising to most, is that Anatoly Tarasov, one of the coaches, and this is very few people know this, one of the coaches who had been a key of the Soviet creation of their system, was not coaching in the 72 Summit Series. Tarasov is given the package as like the father of Russian hockey, the father of Soviet hockey, in that he was the one who created everything, did everything, coached everything. And actually, that's not true. There were, in fact, two co-coaches most of the time during the 1950s and the 60s. Tarasov was one of them, and the other was a gentleman named Arkady Chernesov. And they each coached two different club teams in Moscow. And each of them at different times had control of the national team in the 1950s. Chernesyev had much greater success alone than Tarasov did. Tarasov had very little. I'm not sure he won a championship actually on his own. But once they were fully combined, you were dealing with two completely opposite people. Tarasov was in a sense thought of as the one in charge because he was the one that was on the bench. He was running the show in the games. He was emotional. He was intense. Generally ran the practices, ran the training regimens. But so he would be considered like the heart of the coaching team. But Chernesyev was the brain. Chernesyev is the one who devised the strategy. Chernesyev is the one who devised the systems. Chernesyev was the one who put together the scouting and the changes that were going to happen in between the games. And it was the combination of the two of them going forward that was an important reason as to how the Soviets were able to become so good and play so well, is because they had brought together the two best coaches that they had in the country. Even though they were almost complete opposites in how they did everything, they forced them to work together, and they found a way to become extremely constructive together. But as 1972 ended, so when Canada refused to hold the 1969 World Hockey Championship in Canada, which was going to be the first time the World Championships were supposed to be held in Canada, and Canada simply refused by the IIHF not allowing any professional players to play in that tournament. So they backed out of that and the Olympics. So this tournament was kind of a behind-the-scenes setup to bring Canada back to international hockey by saying, well, if we let the Soviets play against your NHL stars, then you have to send your other players back to the World Championship, which Canada actually didn't do until 1977 when professionals were allowed to finally start playing at the World Championship. But things were structured in such a way that it took 10 or 15 years before really Canada was able to send a decent team, because the tournament was so early in the first round of the playoffs, where the majority of European players, certainly Russian and Czechoslovakian players, were not in the NHL. So they had access to all of their players, while Canada had to use players off the teams that didn't make the playoffs. And back then, that was, you had your choice of players from Colorado and Washington and Cleveland and Vancouver and St. Louis and Minnesota. There was no chance of putting together any kind of decent team for quite a long time. Anyway, it did grow. We had the 76 Super Series, where Russian teams played North American club teams. That should be a video in itself. Again, what's not talked about that series, the 76 Canada Cup, which you could really classify as the first real true international tournament, where the 6 major hockey nations all had their best players playing, although the Soviets held back some of their talent for that particular Canada Cup. But anyway, we're going to get into this a bit with roster packaging. But in 72, when the season had ended in March, April, Tarasov was relieved as coach of the Soviet team, the Soviet national team. It's not sure exactly what happened. There's speculation that he had allowed the players to keep some money that they had got access to before the Olympic tournament started in Sapporo, Japan. There's also some stories in the Red Machine book that he had kind of embarrassed the political executive in a championship game in Moscow by refusing to play unless a particular goal had been overturned or not overturned. I don't remember the whole story off the top of my head, but there were certain things that kind of just seemingly got the decision makers to say, we don't want this guy around anymore. And they went to a brand new coaching staff going into 72, in the 72 Summit Series, which was Vesvolod Bobrov and Boris Kulagin, both star players. Certainly Bobrov was the star player of Soviet hockey. And I guess the thinking was, on some levels, that it was time to move away from a Tarasov more completely team-oriented, goal-only, and start saying we've got to allow certain star players that seemed to be developing at that particular time. Harlamov and Petrov and Shadrin. Yakushev hadn't become a star yet at this time until the series was over. With the idea of producing more, a little bit different style of play where these star players could expand. I don't know the whole story, but certainly that's a big shock. It's a big shock for the Soviets themselves, that for literally 20 years, you have a particular coaching staff that had been preparing their team on one level, yes, to win world championships and win Olympic games and improve and get better, but they were preparing them to be able to play against the NHL stars and Canadian stars in Canada and beat them. That's what part of what Tarasov and Chernessev were doing. And all of a sudden, when they finally get the chance to do it, the players are going in with a brand new set of coaches. And so the first thing for me is, I see this as the first problem that the Soviets are dealing with, is that they're, in a sense, going into a very unknown situation for them. Just as the Canadians were going into an unknown situation, they were going into a very unknown situation with the games against Canada. And they were kind of doing so with, albeit a coach that they knew, that they had grown up watching, that they had grown up respecting, that they had, in one sense wanted to emulate. But he had not really been their coach for very long. And so they really didn't know how to deal with various situations, and particularly any kind of adversity that was going to come up with. Tarasov did go with the Soviet team to Canada. He was there, but it seems like he was just there as an observer capacity, but no one, again, is really sure what's happening or not happening in the inner workings of these organizations. But that was the first strange thing, that they're going in with a completely new coaching staff. The roster makeup of the Soviet team was good. Certainly, though, from this series and what they learned and how they were going to construct hockey players in the future, every Soviet team that came after this was vastly superior. They even though the same players would be playing roughly in 77, 78, 79, the quality of play of all of the players is drastically improved. The forwards in this series were, and we'll get to Canada's team and the problems that Canada's roster had, but certainly the Soviet forwards were, as a whole, a better unit. They were much faster. They handled the puck better. Obviously not as good in the corners, not as good in front of the net, not as good on faceoffs at this time. They improved in all of those areas in the 5 to 10 years going forward. But they still had an advantage in outright skill. The defense was a combination of young players who were about to become much, much better. Vasiliev, Luchenko, even Gusev, and with some older players, Kuzkin and the like. But the defense for this series is average. It's I would almost say that it's even the Czechoslovak defense of this 72 period might have been a bit better than the Soviet defense. The goaltending is the first place where the Soviets make a giant jump. Even through the 1960s, I'm going to talk about some of the games and exhibitions that had happened between North Americans, between Canada and the Soviets in the 1960s, more than people think, with way more information that should have been available to Team Canada for the preparation stage. But the Soviets had always had a disadvantage in that the Canadians always had the best goaltender by a wide margin. No matter what tournament they were going in, the Canadian goalie would be better than what the Soviets were putting in their net. And when Vladislav Tretiak came along this was something Tarasov recognized. Tarasov recognized that they're never going to be able to beat the Canadians until they have a goalie that can do it. And the Soviets would not have said yes to this tournament. You know, the standard story had been, when the Soviets agreed to the tournament, that we are here to finally have this competition. We're here to test our players against your players. We're here to learn from this series. We're here to see where we need to grow. In one level, that's all true. They weren't lying about that. But they were not presenting that the reason they said yes to the series is because they thought they could win. They would not be saying yes to a series of games against a non-communist nation in the middle of the Cold War unless they thought they were going to be very successful doing it. So this backdrop of the Cold War is going to become very, very intense, and it's going to become very changing by the end of it. Certainly how Canadians in general saw Russians and the Russian people, and a different respect they gained for them and their country. A great respect for their players and their hockey ability, less respect for some of the tactics that they would use. But this element of the Cold War plays into this extremely highly, and we'll talk about that from the Canadian side again when we get to their roster construction. But the Soviets were not going to say yes to the series unless they thought they could win, and having Tretiak began to show them that they were ready. They were ready. And on some level, I think they understood, and I don't know what the level of pre-scouting had been of the Soviet team for North Americans prior to the tournament fully being set up. How much in the 71-72 season they were studying North American hockey. But as I'll talk about, This is Canada, the roster that Canada put together, which was, other than some exceptions, this was as good a roster as this is what Canada had. This was probably the worst Canadian roster pretty much ever that could have been put together. I'll show you the difference between just 4 years ahead in 76 and what the roster would have been 4 years behind in 68. This was a relatively weak Canadian team by comparison. Strong compared to what every other nation in the world had, but for what Canada had the possibility of presenting in other years, this was a weak roster. And I think somehow the Soviets knew that they kind of knew this was an opportunity as well, because the roster they were going to face from Canada was average. And they now had, I mean, I'm not sure they knew just how good Tretiak was going to be. Certainly, he was very good in this series. He was not yet the Tretiak that you would see in the games in 76 in the World Championships later on. He was still a very good goalie, getting better. But he gave them equal footing. So that there was no advantage in goaltending like there used to be. And that gave the roster, the Soviet roster, this opportunity of they're going in potentially relatively equal to their opponent on straight up talent. So that was what the Soviet roster was being put together. Let's talk about the Canadian roster and how the Canadian roster was put together. Which, as I said, this became a very weak roster. Now, originally, the choice of players would have been a little bit bigger, save that this was also the year that the World Hockey Association started. So when the rival league began and actually began to be able to bring over some star NHL players who just wanted to start getting paid what they kind of felt they would be worth, the Canadian team right away loses Bobby Hull and Jerry Cheevers and Derek Sanderson and J.C. Tremblay and a few others who went to the WHA. And the NHL owners were, through Alan Eagleson, were very clear that this is an NHL series, and it's not that they were so upset with the WHA, they were a bit worried. Before the WHA started, in one sense, while they felt confident, they also could sense there was a sense of unknown that what if this rival league does things better than us? What if this rival league does things smarter than us, and we actually have to open our wallets and start innovating and start actually looking after players? Because certainly up to the 1960s, players were not, in any of the major sports in North America, were not completely slaves, but to that level that all players should have been getting 2, 3, 4 times the amount of what they were getting, given the numbers of the amount of revenue that was coming in from the games. The players were unbelievably poorly paid by comparison. And certainly because of the WHA, the salaries within all of hockey began to skyrocket because NHL teams had to start paying guys much more lucrative salaries, or they knew they're just going to leave and they're going to go play for New England or Houston or Quebec or whoever in the WHA. So they just blocked off all of these players. Now, given that everyone involved with this series on the Canadian side, like everyone involved with the team and the construction package and everyone putting this together, assume that Canada is going to win 8 games of the series. Again, it's an 8-game series. Like, that's just the craziest thing you can ever think of. Like, there's no such thing as an 8-game series. You know, you always have an odd number of games, 5, 7, 9, so that you can have a guaranteed winner at the end, not the way this could be set up where you could easily have a tie. Anyway, Canada was so sure they were going to win the 8 games that they didn't see it as a huge problem to particularly not have Bobby Hull in the lineup. The other players were not as vital necessarily, but they still would have been helpful. When you look then at the roster as it was constructed, the next player that's missing on this team is Bobby Orr. Bobby Orr's knee was just not able to let him play in any of the games, although he did start practicing. He did go to Moscow for games 5 to 8, and he did practice. And there was some question marks as to maybe whether he could play game 7 and 8, sort of as a power play specialist, but there was very little chance that was going to happen. So really what you would consider 2 of Canada's 3 best players are not able to play. And the loss of Orr on one leg in the 76 Canada Cup was still one of the best players on the ice, was still a dominant reason why Canada was able to win that series. So certainly a much better Bobby Orr. He's going to play 28 minutes a game. He's going to control the puck. And it's going to mean that somebody else doesn't have to play the 28 minutes that he's playing. So when you actually wind up at, well, what's the rosters that did actually make this team, that did actually make this series? Like I say, at the time, if you were there in 1972, you would think, what a team to put all these guys on one roster. And in a sense, yes, but we'll look at it, but we'll piece this together. So we'll start with the defenseman, which is, I think, that one of the glaring areas of this team. Canada sends in 72. It puts a roster together of basically a 6 that's going to play most of the series of Brad Parkin, Gary Bergman, Savard and Lapointe, Bill White, and Pat Stapleton. The other 2 guys who actually played in games, this is amazing, actually played in games and were badly torched by the Russians every time they played. That was Don Orey and Rod Sealing. I mean, if you look at knowing what everyone knows about the best of Soviet hockey games and looking through the 81, the 84, the 87 Canada Cup and the various games that were played in those series, to think that you could have Don Orey and Rod Sealing playing against, Makarov and Larionov and Kamensky would just, you just would not contemplate that. But here they were on the roster and playing in game 1 in Montreal. If you look just 4 years ahead, so you look at the roster Canada put together in the 76 Canada Cup, they only used 5 defensemen in most of those games. But those 5 defensemen were Bobby Orr, Larry Robinson, Dennis Potvin, Serge Savard, and Guy Lapointe. So given that Lapointe and Savard are on both rosters, we can cancel them out. Certainly the Savard and Lapointe in 76, though, are much more experienced in everything they were doing. So they were better players. Orr was, even on one leg, is a better player than Park in 72. Then you're looking at White, Stapleton, and Bergman against Dennis Potvin and Larry Robinson. It's not even a comparison. If you went back to 1968, so let's say we go back 4 years, the likely roster that Canada puts as its defense is a very young Bobby Orr, Pierre Pilote, Tim Horton, Jacques Laperriere. They probably would have then used maybe a Bill Gadsby, maybe an Alan Stanley, maybe a Carl Brewer, maybe a J.C. Tremblay. That's certainly defensively pretty good roster. At least equal, if not better, than the one that went in 72. Let's look at the forwards. So the forwards that Canada winds up putting together did what it needed to do to win the series, but again, it was certainly the thing about the 72 Canadian team was probably no team did more with what they had than that roster. That roster was like a 7 out of 10 roster for Canada, and they achieved a very difficult goal. Well, other rosters are going in with like a 9 out of 10 roster. They did more with what they had than certainly any other Canadian team. But we're looking at just on paper. You had what turned out to be a running first line. Originally was Frank Mahovlich, Phil Esposito, and Ivan Cournoyer. Mahovlich, while a good player in the NHL, a very good player in the NHL, just certainly in 72 could not skate with the Russians. Just couldn't skate. And so because he couldn't skate, really didn't offer much help for Cournoyer and Esposito. And in fact, it was only when they made a change to either put in J.P. Parise or Wayne Cashman into that left wing spot that Esposito and Cournoyer improved their play. And once J.P. Parise was kicked out of Game 8, that role first went back to Frank Mahovlich, and nothing happened, and they had to change to Peter Mahovlich, who was a better skater. The ability to skate was going to be very, very important in the series, and I'm not sure, again, the coaching staff understood the importance of feet mobility and puck mobility was going to be for this series. That's where the second line had, one sense, a tremendous advantage over all the other Canadian lines and why they were so good. That was the line of Paul Henderson, Bobby Clarke, and Ron Ellis. Clarke, we'll get to Clarke in a second. Henderson is the hero of the series, right? He scores the winners in Game 6, Game 7, Game 8. People forget that. They remember, most will know he scored the winner in Game 8. They don't realize he scored a spectacular goal to win Game 7 with 4 minutes left. And it just happened that his was the goal that won Game 6 as well. Henderson was fast, and he was in shape. When Henderson got the opportunity, when he finally made the decision through a conversation with another former or a current Olympian in another sport, and he decided that he was going to go full on, he, unlike anyone else who in North America at that time, you didn't actually train in the off season. You didn't get yourself ready. You came to training camp in the end of August, early September, and you worked yourself into shape for a month and then played your exhibition games, and then you were kind of ready to start the season. And then 2 or 3 weeks in, you were okay. Henderson, who was, first of all, was fast, he got himself into tremendous shape. So when you watch Paul Henderson play in those games, you're watching a guy who skates as good, if not better, than most of the Russians. And that's one of the reasons he played so well, is that his other skills could come into tremendous fore because he could outskate the Soviet players. He didn't have to necessarily think his way through, pass his way through, bull his way through. He could just skate through them. Bobby Clarke could also skate. Bobby Clarke was also in very good shape, which was just, Clarke was one of the few North Americans who actually had an off-ice summer program. Bobby Clarke was already, because of the combination of the diabetes and the combination of just having a will that, the greatest worker probably in history. One of the dirtiest players, along with Ted Lindsay and Dale Hunter and a few others at the same time. And that combination of will and nastiness put quite a streak. There were a lot of Soviet players in the course of the series that got very afraid. And of course, Clarke gets the finger pointed on him for the slash that he gave on Valery Harlamov in Game 6. But Boris Mikhailov kicks Gary Bergman with his skate and cuts up his leg pretty badly in Game 7. And you have to look very, very carefully to find all the spears and the butt ends that the Soviets were wringing out in the course of that series. It's just Clarke's were a little more open. A lot of stuff he didn't need to hide as much. Those two guys created a line that was just outstanding because of the speed and the tenacity they were both bringing. And if they could have had a right winger that could play, like could really play, that line was the best line Canada had in the series. And it would have been, Ron Ellis? Who would think that you would want on your main, what turned out to be your main checking / turned out to be scoring line, Ron Ellis? this is not the guy you would think you'd want there on that roster. And he did a decent job defensively. Obviously, he and Henderson knew each other, so that helped in the familiarity standpoint. But there's a lot of opportunities where Ellis had the puck in the slot or near the net, and nothing came of it. Watch the games again carefully. I watched the games intensely. So that was that line. Then your third line turned out to be Rod Gilbert, Jean Rattel, and Dennis Hull. Again, Dennis Hull is playing for Team Canada. Okay, he's a 25, 30 goal scorer. Pretty much never thought about back checking in his life. Was kind of really there because, well, if they said no to Bobby Hull, well, we'll say yes to his brother and make it seem like we're fair. He turned up getting in the roster, did score a couple of goals in the series. Then you added roll-in players by Moscow, like I say, Pete Mahovlich and Red Berenson, and who else was in and out of the lineup in Moscow? Frank Mahovlich, JP Parise. There were some others who had played some games, be they Vic Hadfield, Gilbert Perreault, Rick Martin, a couple others that are just escaping my mind, Mickey Redmond. Most of those players were not in very good shape, did not play well. But that was Canada's forwards roster going into the tournament. In 1976, when you look at Canada's roster, what they put forth there, you had Bobby Hull, Phil Esposito, and Gilbert Perreault, Steve Shutt, Peter Mahovlich, and Guy Lafleur, Bill Barber, Bobby Clark, and Reggie Leach, Bob Gainey, Daryl Sittler, Lanny McDonald, and Marcel Dion was like an extra guy that you would float in. Actually, eventually, Esposito became the guy that was floating through the lineup, and Dion played with Perreault and Hull. But that's your roster. I mean, the difference is staggering. Like, the difference is utterly staggering. The only three guys that are there on the same roster is Esposito, Mahovlich, and Clark. Clark was a better player in 76. Mahovlich was a better player in 76. Esposito had lost a bit of a step, and Esposito would never play to the level he played at in the 72 series, and on all levels. He was good in 76, but other than that, if you try to match up just about everybody other than Henderson, like if you could put Henderson, almost put Henderson and Guy Lafleur equally, even though there's no way they would be equal as hockey players for their whole career, but just the way Paul Henderson played for 8 games can be equal to the way Guy Lafleur played the 5 or 6 or 7 games of the 76 Canada Cup. You could almost have them as equal players. Beyond that, pretty much everyone else is a Hall of Fame player in 1976, and they're not in 1972. Certainly not to the same level, right? When the fourth line in 1976 is Bob Gainey, Daryl Sittler, and Lanny McDonald. And your other fourth line would be like, Mahovlich, Red Berenson, and and Frank Mahovlich or JP Parise. It's just not the same. If you went 68, if you just thought, well, what kind of team would Canada put together had they done this in 68? Well, I can just throw the names out just off the top of my head, right? Bobby Hull, Stan Mikita, Henri Richard, Jean Beliveau, Claude Provost, Bobby Rousseau, Gordie Howe, Alex Delvecchio, Norm Ullman, Dave Keon, Frank Mahovlich, John Busick, John Rattel, Ron Ferguson. There's your roster. It's not even you can't even compare the two together. So this goaltending. Goaltending, you had Tony Esposito, who played outstanding in the series and who was, even though he's a Hall of Fame goaltender, he's underrated with how good he was. By playing most of his career in Chicago, when sort of after 72, 73, and they lost White and Stapleton on their defense, and he had to play with a very average defense for the rest of his career, and he was still, he put up tremendous numbers for the huge number of shots he was taking in the course of game after game. Esposito was a great goaltender. Ken Dryden, who I kind of had some semi-negative things to say about in my first hockey book, a bit unfounded. Dryden was an outstanding NHL goalie, but we don't know how good Dryden was going to be because he always played behind a defense where if Dryden just made a save and gave up an okay rebound, the defense is going to handle it. We never got to see him play for the Minnesota North Stars or the Colorado Rockies, even for the Toronto Maple Leafs in the 1970s. Mike Palmateer was a really good goaltender in the late 70s that people kind of forget about because other than when Salming and Lapointe, or Salming and Turnbull were on the ice for the Leafs, the rest of the defense was very, very weak and suspect. Yet Palmateer put up fairly good numbers. Dryden's numbers looked outstanding until you recognize that it's not only that he didn't get many shots, he didn't get many quality shots. So it's hard to know just how good of a goaltender he was. He was a good goaltender, but we just don't have enough comparison. We do know, though, in international hockey that there was a bit of a problem in that Dryden was a stand-up angles, big guy goaltender. And in international hockey, certainly the way the Soviets played was a more side-to-side game in the crease. And Dryden could get himself in a bit of trouble in the side-to-side game. So there was a bit of a, and we don't want to put too much on this because, Ken Dryden did play 2 good games in Game 6 and Game 8 when a lot of pressure was on him both times. He had to win Game 6. And the same thing when it came to Game 8, he had to win. So he had, while Esposito had the same pressure in Game 7, it wasn't so much when he went into Game 5. We'll get to that when we do the second part of the series. But that was the roster. In 76, the team the best goaltenders weren't there necessarily. Dryden wasn't there. Bernie Parent wasn't there. Tony Esposito wasn't there. They went to Rogie Vachon. But Vachon was so good in an international. Well, he was a good goalie in the NHL. I think he could be a great goalie in international hockey because Vachon was quick side to side. He could move in the net really, really well. And so I think there was a bit of an advantage there. If you went, if you went to the goaltending, what would the goaltending have been in '68? Well, they probably would have chosen the 3 goalies they would have chosen would have been Glenn Hall, Johnny Bower, and Gump Worsley. So everything when you look at the roster makeup of 1972 indicates that actually Canada was going in with a fairly weak team overall. Canada's coaching staff was decent from the standpoint of Harry Sinden. He'd won a Stanley Cup in 1970, then quit because he didn't get enough money from the Bruins going forward. So he hadn't been coaching for a few years. He was working in Rochester, Rochester, New York, on a building company, I think is where he was working. He had been a part of the Whitby Dunlops, winning the World Championship in '58, so he had direct experience with the Russians of playing them, but playing them 14 years earlier. And they had changed a lot in 14 years. And while he knew they were going to be facing a much better team than everybody expected, even Sinden, I don't think was as prepared as he should have been. He had chosen John Ferguson as an assistant coach. And I don't know I wasn't there, so I wasn't in the meetings and the travel and Ferguson might have been a really valuable asset to Sinden from the standpoint of off the ice, in conversations, in talking. But could Canada have perhaps been helped if they had that second coach had been Toe Blake, who was available? And if they'd used Punch Imlach, if they had used one of the other, Emile Francis, one of the other NHL coaches of the day, could Sinden have worked with a different top coach the way Arkady Chernesev and Tarasov had worked together? I don't know. But certainly that was going to be a challenge. And granted, the game strategy and the coaching strategy that was put in place by Canada after game one and before the start of game two was probably some of the greatest coaching in hockey history. In the change that was put forth in a span of 48 hours and how well it was put together to the players and how the players responded to it in game two in Toronto after game one in Montreal. That coaching display was, again, perhaps one of the best in history. So we don't want to go too much into Sinden, but like I would have thought, looking back, the guy they would have wanted as their assistant coach might have been Billy Harris, who wound up coaching the 74 team with the WHA played against the Soviets in that second Summit Series, which a vastly poor or a vastly outmanned roster that WHA team put together played with the Soviets and almost and were in position to almost win all the games, even though they were superiorly lacking in talent. And I think a lot of that was the preparation of Billy Harris and combination of the understanding that had come from 72 and how they had to play. He could have brought some of that, and some other people who had a better understanding of just what they were going to face could have helped them. They didn't choose Harry Sinden and the coaching staff until, what was it, June or something? I don't remember when Sinden was actually selected. But it was after the World Championship. Now, it would have been such a different thing if the coaching staff had been able to have been ready in March and April and could have gone to the World Championship, which was in Prague, could have gone to the World Championship and scouted the Soviets directly. There was a scouting trip that went to Moscow in the end of April, in the end of August, and the Russians kind of played with them a bit. They made sure that these scouts saw nothing. So the scouting report that came back to Team Canada was certainly could not be a proper scouting report, because the Soviets made sure that while the scouts were at these practices, that they just did not see the team at their best in any way, and Tretiak had been out celebrating his wedding engagement, and I think let in 9 or 10 goals in the exhibition game. And so, the goalie is weak, but you would have thought, like, hey, we're not getting much option of seeing guys. How do we get the game film from the 72 World Championship? How do we, teams had to have it, like Sweden, and okay, say you can't get it obviously from the Russians and the Czechs, but Finland, Sweden, the United States, somebody must have the game films. The games were shown on television. They were certainly shown on television in Sweden and a few other places. Go watch the game films. I saw nothing of anyone indicating that the coaching staff and the scouting department of Team Canada had watched closely the game films of Russia's games, the Soviets' games in the 1972 World Championship, or also in the 72 Olympics. 72 Olympics should have also been fairly easy to get access to the games. They're televised all over the world. My sense was they didn't watch, because if you watch the games, if you just watch those games, you're going to get a much better sense of what they do, how they do things. You would have been able to prepare. And so that's one. And I'm going to get to the end of the roster setup, and I'll probably stop for this. It'll have to be a 2 or 3 part series. Is you would have devised strategies based on the understanding of how your opponent was going to play and how different they were going to play. You would have prepared for that in the pre-camp that was held in Toronto in August. Canada, it seemed, had one philosophy of teaching going in, and that was offense. Serge Savard talked about that he was concerned before the series started, because all they talked about was how many goals they were going to score, how they were going to score more goals, not How are we going to defend this team? How are we going to play a solid defense? And it was all about high, intense forechecking. I mean, basically the way the Boston Bruins played. Harry Sinden just said, we're going to play like the way the Boston Bruins play. That was his basic idea. And that's fine when your team was the Boston Bruins and could win 2 of 3 Stanley Cups because you have Orr and Esposito and Hodge and Busick and Sanderson and Westfall and McKenzie and Vadnais, that you can swarm your opponent. The belief was he thought they could do the same thing. They would be able to swarm the Soviets. Surprisingly, if you had seen their systems enough, you would have instantly realized we need a different strategy. We need a strategy that is at least much more neutral in our aggressiveness in order to counteract, certainly, especially when the Soviets have the puck. When the Soviets have the puck with any kind of space, charging at the Soviet player is not going to be your most effective way of checking and containing the puck carrier. Already, the Swedes had been the first to come, not the first, but they were one of the first to start using a trapping kind of system against the Soviets with really good success. The Swedes had played very, very well against the Soviets in the late 60s and the early 70s, using this somewhat of a trapping style that really came out of the Ottawa Senators in the 1920s and then through the Toronto Maple Leafs in the 40s and 50s. They were kind of the first ones to sort of play a type of neutral zone trapping system at times. And Sweden had already began developing something like that to how to deal with the Soviets. There was nothing going on in Canada's preparation that was, here's how we're going to handle how the Soviets play hockey. It was, we are arrogantly so much better than anybody else that we don't care what anyone else is doing. We just do what we do and we're going to win 10-1. That was the kind of thinking that existed in up and down through Canada's concepts. And as I start the next series of the videos, we're going to talk about other things that happened, other games that happened in the 1960s, including some players who were on this particular 72 roster who should have known better, who should have been better prepared for what they were going to be up against and what they were going to be up against in Russia, what the conditions in Moscow were going to be like on so many levels. They've already experienced it, from treatment of the officials, treatment of the sort of behind the scenes thing, the way the Soviet team plays. All of this was ignored. The amount of potential preparation that was ignored was staggering, truly staggering. And while Canada did have, for its time period, a very intense training camp, every guy who was at that camp would say that's the hardest training camp they've ever been at. It still would not in any way match the Soviet preparation, right? The kind of off-ice work that the Soviets were doing had them physically, they were at a physical peak already walking into that series. And interestingly, the Soviets played better in the North American rinks than they did on the large ice surface. Part of it, you can say, well, Canada was just not in good shape. Well, Canada was actually in better shape than people might say. And you have to watch the games carefully to see that there tends to be a moment in the games where you notice there's a conditioning shift. There's like literally a moment where it's like, okay, Canada's running out of gas now. But up to that moment of time, they're competing fairly well with that roster. What's interesting is on the larger ice surface, the fact that the Soviets were better puck handlers, were better at holding the puck, were better at not giving the puck away. That's actually a better strategy on a small rink than it is on a big rink, because by holding the puck longer and longer on a bigger rink, technically what happens is you wind up moving farther and farther away from the goal. Yeah, you can make the rush on the defenseman and pivot to the side of the boards, but now you've run out of more space, where on a small rink you can't do that. Your pivot's going to have to be quicker, and you're going to have to make a faster choice with the puck. You can make a longer pivot, a longer turn on a big ice rink and have lots of time, let more movement happen, but it also gives your defensive team more time to get themselves into play, more time to read and react to what's likely going to happen. So, interestingly, on the smaller surface, the Russians were a better team. That they actually, their style, their conditioning, and their surprise of play, it was better for them that the series started in Canada than the series started in the first 4 games in Moscow. If the first 4 games had been in Moscow, actually, I think probably for sure it would have come out 2-2. It went. The Soviets had 2 wins with 1 tie in Canada. I think it probably would have been 2-2 if the first 4 games were in Moscow. The Soviets on the big ice surface checked themselves a lot, which on the small ice rink they couldn't do that. They had to up tempo their puck position game a little bit. But anyway, these are things we'll get into as we get to the beginning of the series and what the series itself is indicating to us. So this was a long 1 hour just on preparation, roster construction, things to think about of how these teams and coaching staffs and everything else was packaged. And like I say, we haven't got past the training camp yet. So there'll be a part 2 coming up at some point. Thanks for paying attention. By the time part 2 comes out, I'm sure everybody will now have seen one of the documentaries and will be in much better shape to discuss the actual on-ice experiences of this series. Thanks, guys. Cheers.